Well, hello and welcome to the live cast. It's good to be back with you. It's been a few weeks.
It has been a couple of weeks since we've been live. So last week we weren't live either.
And we're still not live.
We're still not live.
Still not live.
This is the welcome to the recorded cast.
Yeah, absolutely. We hope everyone's had a good Easter time, and you've kind of been rested if you've been away and things like that. But I'm sure if you're like us, you're now back into the full swing of things again.
Raring to go.
Raring to go, absolutely. So today we're talking about the issue of persecution in the global church, and we're kind of talking about this off the back of the events of this weekend. You've probably seen on the news the bombs that went off in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday morning, and 3 churches were targeted, as well as 4 hotels in the kind of capital city of Colombo. And at the moment, as the death toll stands, it's at 321 people have been killed, 45 of whom they say are children. And there are still, the 500 or so have been wounded. There are still people, they're saying, fighting kind of for their lives in intensive care. At the moment, it's still a little hazy who's quite responsible for it. 2 kind of little-known Islamic groups have been linked to it. But then also today, Islamic State have claimed responsibility. But there doesn't seem, from what I've seen, there doesn't seem to have been any evidence put forward from any sides as to why they think it's these people, or who, those who are claiming responsibility don't seem to have been able to prove that either. But it's been a huge obviously destruction on a huge scale. There was talk of police finding a 6-foot pipe bomb full of, packed with explosives things, as well as kind of 87 detonators found at the bus station in Colombo.
It could have been even worse. It's amazing. Yeah. As devastating as it was, it could have been even worse. Yeah,
the scale of it is huge, but it seems like they were finding bombs and defusing them, as well as bombs obviously having gone off and stuff. So the defence minister of Sri Lanka has said that, again, they've not released any information as to how they know these things, but they're saying the preliminary investigations have revealed that this was in retaliation for attacks against Muslims in Christchurch. There's shootings only a few weeks ago, so you might remember those events as well. But as I say, at the moment, it all seems a bit hazy. There's a lot of things being thrown around, but no one's really confirming where this information's coming from and stuff. So. Yeah.
And on the same day, obviously Easter Sunday, so targeted at churches, at those celebrating Easter, when we're meant to be celebrating life from the dead. So particularly galling and tragic that here is the death of the living, when we're meant to be celebrating the life from the dead. And also the same day as the Prime Minister was always going to make this sort of public statement about the persecution of the church more globally, and even before the bombs ripped through those churches in Sri Lanka, she said that she would be spending her Easter in church giving thanks, and she'd be giving thanks because many Christians around the world will face huge danger for doing exactly what she was going to do in Britain in great safety. And of course the tragic irony of it is that she didn't quite know how dangerous it would prove to be that Easter Sunday for worshippers to gather. And so Theresa May on Easter Sunday said that the government has launched a global review into the persecution of Christians, and she wants to ramp that up. And so Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt is going to expand his government review into the worldwide persecution of churches. And that's going to be led, and is being led, by the Bishop of Truro, who is going to talk about how this government can better support those who are under threat. And it was very interesting that the Bishop of Truro, what's he called again? Philip Mount Stephen. He actually wrote in the Times in the aftermath of the Sri Lankan attacks. And here's this person who is tasked with the job of looking into persecution of Christians around the world. And he said he noticed something in the coverage of the Sri Lankan accounts, that there wasn't perhaps the same level of attention given to Christian victims of persecution as perhaps in other atrocities that have happened. And he wondered aloud in the Times whether it was a sense of post-colonial guilt And this sense that, well, obviously we all know in this country that Christians are the majority. They are not the victims, they are the victimizers. They are not the persecuted, they are the persecutors. And we just don't, we don't have a sense in our cultural narrative that it's the Christians who would be getting the wrong end of the stick, because isn't it the Christians who are the bad guys around the world? And so he wrote very intelligently about the fact that is not the state of play around the world. Open Doors is a UK charity, and they've published this year a report that says that there are 245 million Christians worldwide who are facing severe persecution. And 80% of all persecution, all religious persecution in the world, is targeted at Christians, which I think that's a quite surprising thing for most secular Westerners. Is it that Christians are the most persecuted group on planet Earth, religiously speaking?
Yeah, I would have thought so.
It doesn't really fit the narrative, because the Christians are the bad guys. We are the ones who are persecuting everybody else. We're the ones with the cultural power. And yet, at some point, we've got to have a look at reality. At some point, we've got to look at these stats, like what Open Doors have said, and you've been looking at some other stats online as well that Open Doors have kind of come up with.
Yeah. So Open Doors have said that this. I don't know when they say this year. That's the study they did this year. 245 million Christians worldwide face severe persecution, which is obviously a huge number. 80%, as you said, of religious persecution is directed at Christians, and it falls disproportionately on women. And it said in 59% of the 50 countries surveyed, sexual assault was described as a characteristic of religious persecution, and 47% said rape was also common, related to a woman's Christian identity or choice of faith. And then it said Christian men are most often subject to pressures related to work, military or militia conscription, and non-sexual physical violence, whilst women are specifically and most frequently targeted through forced marriage, rape, and other forms of sexual violence. So, I mean, the scale is huge, but we don't hear much about that kind of thing here, do we, so much?
No. And, and very interesting that in the same week as the bombs ripped through the churches in Sri Lanka, on the Monday of Holy Week, Notre Dame was burnt. And you came up with an interesting stat just today about that.
Yeah, we were saying that Google searches for Notre Dame versus Google searches about the Sri Lankan bombings were actually 7-1. So there've been 7 times more searches, people searching for Notre Dame and information on that than there have been about the Sri Lankan bombings.
And that's particularly tragic when you think that in 1 Peter 2 it describes the real temple, the living stones, people who are built together on the Lord Jesus, the chief cornerstone, and that really obviously our hearts and our sympathy must be for people. And it's Christians built together that are the true church. I often say when I'm in a beautiful church, I say, this is not a beautiful church. It's not that you've come into church this morning. It's that the church has come into this beautiful building. And the beautiful building of Notre Dame burnt down, but really the temple of the living God was blown apart on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka. And so there is a mismatch of value when we care more for things than we do for people. But there are other factors involved in that. There were far more smartphones in Paris, and so there are far more pictures of what's going on. And so as people search for the images of what happened in Paris, they're going to get images of what happened in Paris. And there are reporters on the ground, and that's much less the case in Sri Lanka. It's even less the case in places like Sudan or northern Nigeria, where there are churches being burnt down and people murdered quite frequently there. And yet we don't hear about it, and partly that's just a function of there aren't reporters on the ground and there aren't those sorts of things. So it's not as though there's necessarily a targeted bias against Christians in these things. It's just the nature of the case that if something happens closer to home, you're going to have more reporters covering it. But persecution globally is definitely a thing, and religious persecution is massively a thing, and 80% of it is directed at Christians. And I just wonder whether that's like a narrative that we don't hear enough of, and maybe we don't hear enough of it because we tend to think that Christianity is Western. Certainly secular people in the West tend to think that Christianity is the white man's religion. And yet that's simply not the case. I've been reading this great new book by Rebecca McLaughlin called Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Largest Religion. I was talking to Sam Aldridge the other day. He said, this book is the new reason for God. This is this generation's reason for God book, and I have been reading it. It is a sensational book, and she sort of starts out by exploding some myths about Christianity in the world. And she says, look, in Western Europe and North America, the proportion of people identifying as religious has certainly shrunk. But at a global level, not only has religion failed to decline, but sociologists are now predicting an increasingly religious world. While numbers do not tell the whole story, by 2060, the latest projections suggest Christianity will still be the largest global belief system, having increased slightly from 31% to 32% of the world's population. Islam will have grown substantially from 24% to 31%. Hinduism is set for marginal decline from 15% to 14%, and Buddhism from 7% to 5%. Judaism will hold stable at 0.2%, and by 2060, the proportion of humanity identifying as atheists, agnostics, or none will have declined from 16% to 13%. Yes, declined. For those of us who grew up under the secularization hypothesis, this comes as a surprise, pleasant or otherwise. So what is happening? And then she goes and takes 12 chapters to have a look at that question. What's happening? Why is Christianity still the most growing belief system in the world? And that's kind of not what people think, because people see churches in England being converted into blocks of flats, and they think, well, that's the church in decline. What's interesting is, you never see the story about, the church that's just bought out a cinema and has taken it over and is turning secular spaces into spaces for Christians to meet in. You don't hear those stories so much, but certainly the narrative here is that in the West we are declining, but that is not at all kind of the international perspective. And you were looking at some statistics as well on the growth of the church and how it's non-Western.
Yep, so how things have kind of flipped round. So 100 years ago, a century ago, 80% of Christians lived in North America and Europe, and it's just 40% today. But in 1980, more Christians were found in the global south than the north for the first time in 1,000 years. So today the Christian community in Latin America and Africa alone accounts for 1 billion people. So things have kind of flipped quite substantially, and we watched, there's the little Open Doors map.
Gospel maps,
Gospel map of
Gospel
how that
map
has changed over time, and you can see how Christianity has spread out into the south far more than in the north.
And it's like as the church grew, like from the first century, for the great majority of the time, up until really about 1300 or 1400, there were more Christians east of Jerusalem than west of Jerusalem. So the idea that Christianity is a Western thing, actually for the majority of church history, kind of before the Middle Ages, and now, ever since 1980, it certainly hasn't been a Western European thing at all.
Do you want to hear this bit about William Carey?
Yeah.
So it says, when William Carey went to India at the threshold of the 19th century, only 1% of the entire world's Protestants were found in the non-Western world. So that meant that 99% of all Protestants lived in the Western world. So it's no wonder people call Christianity a white man's religion. Even 100 years after Carey at the turn of the 20th century, only 10% of the world's Protestants lived in the non-Western world. However, the 20th century witnessed a dramatic shift downward and eastward, such that today approximately 67% of the world's Protestants live outside of the Western world. That means that today the majority of Protestant Christians are non-white and non-Western in their ethnic and geographic orientation.
And so, I mean, you get that, the average Anglican in the world is a 25-year-old Nigerian woman who has to walk more than a mile to get water every day. That's
Sure.
When you think of an Anglican, what do you think of? You should think of, a young Nigerian woman. That's the picture of global Christianity. And therefore, if you are against Christianity, you just need to be aware that you are against a whole lot of racial minorities, even within the West. So, for instance, Black Americans in the US, 75% of them say that religion is very important to them. Less than half of white Americans say the same. So 3/4 of all Black Americans say religion, and they're speaking almost universally about Christianity at that point, is very important to them. And so if you, in the name of inclusion, want to poo-poo Christianity because you think it's the white man's religion and you think it's the oppressor in all these things, you end up speaking against and ridiculing people of color, Latinos and blacks in America. And so this whole narrative that to be on the side of the oppressed is to be against Christianity, just even within the West, we need to completely get rid of that. Christianity is truly global, and it's global in a way that other faiths just aren't. So 95% of Muslims live in one of three places, the Middle East, North Africa, or South Asia, particularly Indonesia. That's 95% of Muslims. You can sort of group in that sort of way. 88% of Buddhists live in East Asia. 92% of Hindus live in India and South Asia. So for these great world faiths, they very much are associated with certain areas of the world, and even in terms of Hinduism, with certain races, but not so with Christians.
No, so 25% of Christians live in Central or South America, 22% live in Africa, 15% in Asia, 12% in North America, and 20% in Europe. So obviously that's a much broader, that's a much more evenly spread kind of spread.
Yeah, it's quite the spread of a spread.
Yeah, spread of a spread.
When people say, I could never be a Christian because I'm so much for inclusion, and Christianity is against inclusion, you just think, well, actually, Christianity is the most inclusive belief in the history of mankind. The church is the most inclusive institution that anyone has ever seen, encompassing people from different races and tribes and classes and cultures, uniting them together in this one body. It's just phenomenal. It's the most phenomenal sociological thing that's ever happened in the history of the world. So, often as Christians, you can feel like you're on the back foot when somebody starts bringing up the issue of inclusion and diversity. And you're like, well, I know the most inclusive, diverse group on the planet.
Yeah, I'm actually part of it. What group are you part of? How inclusive is your group? So
come on in.
Yeah.
But one thing I really wanted to kind of think about was, so Theresa May has wanted Jeremy Hunt to step up this global review of persecution around the world, and then that has caused other people in the UK to say, all right, there is persecution out there in the world. How can you deny that when the bombs go off in Sri Lanka? But Conservative MPs David Davis and Gary Street are wanting to say, let's turn our focus on the UK because there is persecution here in the UK. And David Davis told the Mail on Sunday, Mr. Hunt is quite right to look at the dreadful persecution Christians suffer in some countries, but he should also be mindful that many Christians suffer discrimination in our own country. He should ask the bishop to expand his inquiry. Gary Street said, there's certainly a case to be made that in the UK we are marginalised. And I wonder if we can think about what do we make of that? It seems hard to try to put ourselves forward as marginalised and persecuted when 321 Sri Lankans have lost their life.
Absolutely. So it's all kind of relative, isn't it?
Right.
you see that, or you compare a few years ago where, Islamic State were kind of sweeping through areas of the Middle East, and Christians were being forced to leave their homes or being beheaded or put up on crosses. And then anything we face kind of pales into insignificance, really, doesn't it? Yeah. So, I mean, it would be fair to say that there are definitely definitely instances where we can say Christians are discriminated against, or people think Christians are stupid or foolish. But I mean, people think flat earthers are stupid or foolish, and it's not a faith thing. We were talking earlier about how, some people would say if you're politically right of Jeremy Corbyn, they'll call you a fascist. If you question about immigration policy in any way, shape or form, they'll say you're xenophobic or racist. And people just love to throw
epithets.
Yeah,
should we say epithets?
Yeah. Let's do that. They love to throw these things at each other. But people are doing that regardless of faith. People are throwing these epithets at each other, regardless of
word for today.
Yeah, it's not simply because of people's religion.
I mean, everybody has the experience of you're about to tweet something or you're about to post something on Facebook, and you're like, oh, should I? Because maybe. And it's not just Christians who feel like they need to self-censor.
Sure.
Yeah. Or they might get into trouble. Case. Any number of feminists are very nervous that they'll be called a trans-exclusionary radical feminist, a TERF, because of certain views about gender, not tied to religion in any way. A friend of ours we were just talking to really believes in homeschooling, and he kind of feels homeschoolers are looked upon with real suspicion. What are they getting up to behind closed doors and that sort of thing. But then as he was reflecting, he was kind of like, well, actually, the homeschooling community is not exclusively by any means a Christian thing. It's just, we're all bullies, aren't we? And anyone who's in any kind of minority in any situation faces bullying. And
it's hard, isn't it, to say the church here faces persecution. We might want to say, when was the last time you saw a Christian depicted well in the media? What all your characters on TV, were they who are good examples, or they're just presented as kind of slightly trite, backwards types. But then, then people will say like, oh, yeah, but the church, you look at the Church of England and the sway it has.
Right. Bishops in the House of Lords.
Bishops in the House of Lords.
The Queen's the governor of the Church of England.
Schools, faith schools.
Established church.
It's a bit like when people say, oh, the BBC, they're all so left-leaning, and then all the lefties will be like, oh, no, they're so right-leaning. And you're like, well, you can always find stuff either way.
And that's the thing. You can always find it if you're looking for it. And so that's really interesting, as David Davis and Gary Street are saying, well, let's look for it. And as Christians are like, oh yeah, let's look for it. Let's look for it. Like, really? Are we meant to look for it? Again, 1 Peter is just springing to mind. I think this is your homework, people. Your homework this week is read 1 Peter, because it starts out as, the temple really is God's people sort of knit together, but they're knit together in suffering and in persecution, and they really are getting it. Like if you think you're getting it, they're living through Nero and things like that, and yet he even gets to, in 1 Peter 4, he says, if you are persecuted for the name of Christ, then you are blessed, but don't suffer as a meddler, right? It's like there are ways of bringing persecution onto yourself.
Well, yes, and also I know that's not what you meant when you said don't suffer as a meddler. But there are people. It just made me think of like some people wear persecution like a medal.
Yeah,
yeah. Like, and so, how many times I've lost count of people saying like, oh, well, if people are having a go at you, then you must be doing something right.
Yes.
And it's like, possibly,
right.
Or you could just be being a jerk. Like, and there are plenty of Christians who do that as well, who deliberately inflame things.
Yeah.
Who post or say the things that you think were so unwise or needless.
Right.
And you think, no wonder people jumped on you.
Yeah.
Because you've said this or that completely with no context.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they just say, oh, I said it in love. You're like, no.
Because telling the truth is love. Yeah. Speak the truth in love is like be a jerk with a smile on your face.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know. I think the truth.
No offense. but
there's definitely persecution we bring on ourselves, and there's definitely times we cry persecution when, I don't know, it's just the nature of living in a fallen world, and there are going to be people who misunderstand you, and there'll be people who sneer at you. Paul was sneered at in the Areopagus, and he didn't call the cops.
Isn't it frustrating for us when you feel we can have a legitimate dialogue or conversation about something, and people shut you down by just labelling you as a transphobe or a homophobe or some kind of bigot or whatever?
Right.
But actually, it's very easy for us to just do the same. As soon as someone questions anything to do with Christianity, we go, "Oh, they're clearly anti-Christian."
Christophobic.
Yeah. Christophobic.
Let's not use that word.
No. But it's very easy to do the same.
Yeah.
Which is what I just think sometimes we don't necessarily, we're a bit blind to that as Christians, that we can be very hypocritical about stuff. I mean, it's the whole. This is why I'm very nervous generally about people censoring any groups.
Right.
And I always find it a bit strange when Christians start. So there's a lot of stuff at the moment about like censoring far-right voices, and I have no interest. I don't want to hear far-right voices in the sense that I don't agree with them. I think a lot of the things that come out of it, or almost everything that comes out of it, is terrible. But I just think if we start censoring them, we'll be next anyway. There's a definite possibility. Yeah. So I always find it strange when Christians are saying we should censor that. I'm just like, but people could easily do the same to us with the same reasoning. So I'd be very nervous of it. But
please don't use the Christophobia thing. I don't know. I've been online for the last 10 years on Facebook. People saying, please, I have a reasoned critique of the ideology behind Islam. Don't call me an Islamophobe, because to call me an Islamophobe is to say that I have an irrational fear of the Muslim, and I love the Muslim, but I'm dead set against the Islamic ideology. So don't call me Islamophobic if I come and bring reasoned critique of the Quran. And that seems fair, right? Islamophobia can be used as a smear to shut down reasoned debates, and the same with transphobia or homophobia. It's not as though that shouldn't be used to shut down reasoned critique of people's positions. And so it's quite often the very same people who say, don't call me a transphobe or a homophobe or an Islamophobe, who now want to say, but let's have this thing called Christophobia, and let's label all these other people as Christophobes. No, let's get out of the phobia suffix. Can we just let's get rid of the phobia suffix?
And the reality is, none of us wakes up on a Sunday morning and goes to church and thinks, I don't know if we'll make it home today.
Right.
It just doesn't happen where we are in the UK or in the US or generally in the Western world.
Right.
We don't have any fear of those things, and so whilst it's definitely right for us to say there's a level of discrimination that does occur.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah. I think it's hard to point to stuff in the Bible and say, oh, this is exactly what the apostles were going through. No, not really.
No.
Those guys really went through it, and people lost their life. And if you've ever read, it's worth getting hold of Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is free. You can get it on Kindle for free. Mm-hmm. You read that and the way people died in the early days, particularly, and it's just horrific.
Yeah. And in a sense, you don't need to, because you just read about Sri Lanka, read about China, read about North Korea, read about Northern Nigeria, and you'll see this stuff really is happening around the world. And I do think it cheapens it to I know nobody wants to equate what we're going through here with those bombings or the persecution that happens around the world. I know nobody wants to equate those things, but when you start to use the same terms for both, it does start to equate them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, are we going to be persecuted? Yes, but persecution is our context. It should never become our complex.
And we need to remember as well that it's if there are voices that persecute against Christianity, it is often a vocal minority. I'm always surprised by how many people. People are still relatively warm to Christian faith in the UK, probably even more so in the US. As much, we were talking the other week about how, in evangelism terms, the US is a bit behind us because they're still such a Christian country, even more so than we are. And we think of ourselves as being quite secularized, but people are still very they're still warm to Christianity. Just think the number of people who don't go to church and then they have kids and they're like, oh, but I wanted to bring the kids along to raise them right, and people still want to come to church. And at Christmas and Easter, I mean, it was Easter morning on Sunday at church. It was rammed.
My church was rammed.
To sit in the special seats at the back, had to get the seats out and whatnot. And most of those people, I'm thinking like, where have you been? Like, who are you? Like, but they've all rocked up. And if they were that anti, if it was like everybody hates the Christians, they wouldn't even turn up at Easter and Christmas like they do.
No. Yeah, our churches were rammed on Easter morning, and no bombs went off. So, that's a win. And the New Testament is far more concerned with when persecution happens, and it will happen, but when persecution happens, we'll pray for your persecutors and bless those who curse you and do good to those who ill-treat you. That's the teaching of the New Testament. And calling the cops and arguing for our rights comes down the list. It does come down the list. And obviously the Apostle Paul does stand up for his rights at various points in the book of Acts, and he uses his Roman citizenship and things like that. So he does maintain his rights to certain treatment at certain times, and that's in the name of justice. That's great, but we believe in something deeper than justice, beyond justice. That is mercy. So, let's be praying for Sri Lanka. Let's be praying for the church there. As you said, we don't go to church worrying whether a bomb's going to go off. It is just it's amazing to think yourself into that position where you wonder, should I go this Sunday? There's a chance. There's a chance there'll be an attack. So let's pray for our brothers and sisters around the world in the persecuted church, and let's, in our own culture, in our own society, not court persecution, but be ready that when it does come, that we would pray for those who persecute us and keep on lifting Christ high. I think that's our little homily for today. Sorry we haven't been live, but basically it's to do with the Wi-Fi that we have here in our temporary accommodation. We're waiting for our studios to be rebuilt, and while we're in temporary accommodation, the Wi-Fi is not really up to the upload speeds that would be required for a Facebook Live. So you'll get us after the fact. Do please comment. We'd love to interact with you in the comments. Be aware that we're going to post this on Friday as well as a podcast. And then we'll get back into the swing of things next week.
Soon, hopefully. We might be back in.
We might be. Well, the works are meant to finish this Friday. So whether we're able to move back into the offices by next week, we shall see.
We'll see.
We'll keep you posted.
Soon.
We'll keep you posted. Awesome. Well,
we'll leave it there then. I guess that's pretty much all we need to say. So great. We'll catch you next time. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.